Beneath the moss-draped stone temples of the ancient Maya, where jungle vines now crawl over forgotten altars and obsidian idols sleep beneath dirt, there was once a world where sex was not a private act. It was not about love. It was not about pleasure. Sometimes it was a ritual, and sometimes it was a sacrifice. The heat clung to the skin like a shroud, thick and unrelenting, as dusk bled into the emerald canopy. Somewhere deep within a ceremonial plaza, the flicker of torchlight marked a procession. A young girl, barely past the first blood of her womanhood, was led silently through the crowd. Her body had been washed in sacred water. Her hair was braided in red ribbons. Her skin was dusted with crushed flowers. She was a virgin, but not for long. At the end of her path stood a priest. His face was masked by jaguar skin. His robe dripped with dried blood and feathers. His hands held no blade, because tonight there would be no death by steel, only the unraveling of something far more intimate. The Maya are often remembered as astronomers and mathematicians, builders of pyramids and keepers of calendars, but hidden within their brilliance was something else, a shadow that lurked behind stone doors and beneath ceremonial masks. A culture that fused the divine with the carnal, that made pain sacred and sex a form of cosmic tribute. This is not a story of savagery, nor is it one of romance. It is the story of what happens when gods demand more than blood, when the altar becomes a bed and the body becomes a sacrifice. Are you ready to enter the temple? To understand the Maya's darkest sexual rituals, we must first understand the world they believed they lived in, a world shaped not by chance, but by divine symmetry. For the Maya, life was a constant cycle of death and rebirth, sacrifice and reward, pain and transcendence. Nothing existed in isolation. Every joy had its mirror in sorrow. Every seed planted required a blood offering. Every storm a divine cause, and every act, no matter how intimate, could echo into the cosmic order. Their gods were not distant, abstract beings. They were ever-present forces embedded in rain, fire, corn, and blood. The Maya pantheon was populated by deities who created and destroyed with equal passion, gods who required not just devotion, but demonstration. Acts of flesh were never merely human. They were divine echoes, recreations of celestial events believed to influence harvest, fertility, and survival itself. Within this system, sexuality was not taboo, it was sacred. Sex, like blood, was a form of communication with the gods. It was not confined to private rooms. It was structured, ceremonial, and often public. Bloodletting, especially from the genitals, was seen as a potent gateway to the spirit world. And women were revered, but also regulated. They were the bearers of blood, the symbolic earth, and the vessels through which cosmic balance could be restored. Yet reverence did not mean freedom. Many women were chosen, not for who they were, but for what their bodies represented. Some were elevated as sacred offerings, selected for ritual acts that blurred the line between worship and violation. Others were discarded or bred for lineage, their identity swallowed by the needs of empire and priesthood. These practices are not myths. Spanish friars like Diego de Landa recorded them in horror. The Madrid Codex and temple carvings whisper their truths in symbols and metaphor. The gods demanded sex, and the people obeyed. But while bloodletting was sacred, what happened in the inner chambers of certain temples was not about blood alone. It was about control, desire, and divine submission. She was not chosen by name, but by blood. The moment her body began to bleed, she was marked. In the Maya world, this was not a private transformation. It was cosmic. Her menstruation was not biology, it was prophecy. She had become a conduit between the earth and the divine. And so she was taken. The fertility virgins were selected at the edge of girlhood, their faces still round with innocence, their eyes wide with confusion. They were celebrated but also separated, from family, from freedom, from childhood. Wrapped in ceremonial garments, anointed with sacred oils, they were kept in isolation, preserved like living offerings. Their skin was scrubbed until raw, their diets monitored, their dreams no longer their own. To the villagers, these girls were honored, symbols of bounty and divine favor, but they were also tools, living extensions of the gods' will, and eventually that will would be enacted. On the night of the ceremony, the temple plaza pulsed with drums and smoke. Hundreds gathered, chanting, watching. The girl, barefoot, trembling, was led through the crowd like a lamb to slaughter. She was not to die. What awaited her was something the Maya believed to be more sacred than death. At the altar stood a priest, not as himself but as a god incarnate. face hidden behind a jaguar mask, arms painted in black and red, chest smeared with dried blood. He was the sky and she was the earth. And their union would birth balance. What followed was not seen as defilement. It was called a ritual, a reenactment of the divine copulation that brought rain, maize, and fertility. Her virgin blood was essential proof of purity, sacrifice, and renewal. The act was public, sometimes witnessed by entire communities. And when it was over, the blood-soaked cloth was raised in triumph, offered to the heavens. She did not scream, or if she did, the drums drowned her. Her tears were not noticed or mistaken for joy. This was not her moment. It was the god's moment, using her flesh as canvas. Stone inscriptions from Kapan and Tikal depict scenes of these ceremonies in abstract metaphor, virgin girls beside serpents and flowering vines. The imagery is beautiful. But beauty can hide cruelty. Afterward, the girl was no longer a virgin, no longer sacred. Sometimes she was discarded. Sometimes she was kept for future rites. But she was never the same. How could she be? And what if she had resisted? What if terror had overtaken devotion? The Maya had no tolerance for refusal. The next ritual ensured that no girl, no matter how frightened, could ever say no. To the Maya, the rain god Chak was not a gentle bringer of life. He was powerful, unpredictable, and hungry. When he desired, he took. And to ensure his blessing, the people gave him what he craved. Among the most unsettling ceremonies of Maya ritual life was the sacred reenactment of divine union, where priests, embodying gods, would ritually take mortal brides in acts of sexual domination. These weren't metaphorical rituals. They were physical performances, saturated with symbolism, spectacle, and submission. The women chosen were not volunteers. Often, they were selected from among previous fertility virgins or captives from rival cities. Before the rite, they were prepared, bathed in herbs, adorned in ceremonial garb, and made to dance in trance-like states. Some were drugged with hallucinogenic Balshay wine. Others were hypnotized through music and repetitive movement, their minds dulled, their resistance worn thin. The setting was theatrical. The temple courtyard filled with incense smoke, firelight flickering off painted murals depicting gods coupling with humans. A priest would step forward, masked in the fanged visage of Chak, his body covered in blue pigment to represent rain and storm. The woman, now a bride of the storm, was laid upon an altar designed not for sacrifice, but for submission. What followed was framed as a sacred union, but there was no consent. This was not a marriage, it was performance. A cosmic drama repeated for the sake of crops, water, and power. The community watched. Some cheered, others prayed, but none intervened. Why did they allow this? Because they believed the gods demanded it. Because to deny Chak his offering was to risk drought, famine, and death. It was not the woman's suffering they saw, it was the promise of rain. Maya murals at Bonampak and Yaxchilan hint at these rites, depicting bound women, erect phalluses, and gods towering over trembling human forms. Spanish missionaries, shocked by what they observed, recorded stories of these ceremonies with trembling quills, accusations of ritual defilement disguised as worship. But to the Maya, it was necessity, harmony. The human body was a vessel, a stage. And in the act of divine union, all things were justified. Not all ceremonies ended in life. Some women broke during the ritual, bones cracked on stone. Others were sacrificed after their usefulness complete, their blood mixed with the rain. What began as submission to a god often ended as annihilation. But even this was only the surface, because not all rituals were born from domination. Some came from devotion, devotion so deep it bled from the most intimate places. In the Maya world, pain was not a punishment, it was an offering, and when pain came from the most sacred part of the body, it was believed to open the soul to the gods. Blood was life, but not all blood was equal. The most revered blood came not from wounds of war, but from acts of devotion, from flesh willingly torn. From places so private, so vulnerable, that offering them was considered the ultimate sacrifice. Men would pierce their penises with stingray spines. Women would slice their genitals with obsidian blades, not once, not quickly, slowly, repeatedly. Each cut was deliberate, each drop of blood a prayer. The ceremony often took place at night beneath a full moon, the air thick with incense, drums pounding like a heartbeat. Participants, nobles, priests, even queens, would kneel before the fire. They would draw their instruments across their flesh and catch the blood on sacred paper. That paper, soaked and trembling, would then be burned. The rising smoke was said to carry their souls upward, to speak directly to the divine. The pain was unimaginable. The screams, if they came, were masked by chanting. This was not weakness, this was sacred agony. For women, the act was often tied to their menstrual cycles. Their natural bleeding was already divine, but self-inflicted wounds were even more holy. By bleeding on command, they became one with the moon, with the tides, with the earth itself. Men, lacking this natural connection, imitated it. They bled from their genitals to mimic the feminine power of creation and destruction. To balance the forces within the cosmos. In the carvings of Yaxchilan, Lady Zook, an elite Maya noblewoman, is shown pulling a rope embedded with thorns through her tongue while her blood drips into a bowl. But this was only one form of suffering. Other carvings, less publicized, show similar acts between the legs. Symbols of serpents emerging from wounds, gods rising from pain. This was not hidden shame, it was glory. The more pain one could endure, the more respect they earned. Some would pass out, others would enter trance states, visions overwhelming their senses as blood drained from their bodies. They believed the gods would appear to them in that moment, drawn by sacrifice. The firelight reflected off bodies slick with sweat and blood. The smell of burning paper mixed with human iron. Silence fell except for breath, ragged and raw. But not all rituals were metaphor. Not all visions came from pain. Some required death. And worse, some required the surrender of life not in battle, but in flesh. Because when the Maya no longer needed symbolic blood, they took living bodies and used them as vessels. The Maya were not only masters of stone and sky, they were architects of lineage. Power flowed through bloodlines, not merely through conquest, but through calculated control of reproduction. And in the shadows of temples and palaces, a darker kind of breeding took place. One not governed by love or even ritual, but by strategy, cruelty, and domination. When Maya warriors returned from war, they brought more than spoils. They brought bodies, captured women taken from rival cities, villages, and borderlands. These women were not sacrificed on the altars. They were kept alive, because their bodies served another purpose, reproduction. These captives were taken into the underbelly of Maya society, sometimes hidden beneath sacred temples or in isolated chambers carved into caves. They're guarded by priests or noble retainers. They were forced into sexual servitude. They were made to bear children not of their own choosing, but of their captors. Their wombs became political tools, factories for producing heirs of desired features, desired status, or simply desired obedience. This was not an act of lust. It was a system of eugenics. The Maya elite carefully curated their bloodlines. Noble men impregnated slaves to blend strength and servility, beauty and compliance. Some children were kept and raised for roles as servants, concubines, or ritual participants. Others were rejected or discarded, unworthy, unclean. There are no temple carvings that openly display this practice. It was not celebrated like the fertility rites. It was not sanctified in codices. But the evidence survives. Spanish conquistadors recorded accounts of discovering chained women in underground hollows near temple complexes, wasted, silent, hollow-eyed. These were not isolated horrors. They were part of a structure designed to serve power. Even the Maya words for these women betrayed their status. Not wives, not priestesses, not even concubines, just vessels, breeders, offerings made not to the gods but to lineage and legacy. Imagine the isolation, the darkness. The ritual chants echoing above while these women labored below, unseen, unheard, endlessly used. No ceremony, no divine justification, only silence and the repeated weight of another man's will. Children born of these unions sometimes bore the tattoos or scars of their mother's captivity. It marked them, set them apart from the children of noble wives. Yet in some cases they were still valued, especially if they possessed beauty, obedience, or strength. They became tools of empire just like their mothers, and when a captive's body was no longer fertile or no longer useful, her fate was often sealed. Some were offered in final sacrifice, others simply vanished beneath the earth, buried in the same silence they were forced to endure. But even death didn't always end their use. Because for the Maya, sex was not confined to the living. Some rituals reached even further into the dark, into the flesh of the dead. In Maya belief, death was not the end. The body was merely a vessel, temporary, fragile, and ultimately discarded. But even in its discarded state, the body still held power, and in the darkest corners of their rituals, that power was not only preserved, it was used. There are whispers, buried in Spanish missionary accounts, hinted at in obscure glyphs, etched into temple stones, of rites that blurred the line between reverence and desecration, of ceremonies where corpses were not simply laid to rest, but symbolically reanimated through sexual performance. It was not about desire. It was about dominance over the veil between worlds, a communion not with the spirit, but with the flesh it left behind. In certain elite burials, archaeologists have found carved phallic objects made of bone, stone, and even jade, placed near the pelvis of female skeletons. Some tomb murals depict serpents emerging from the bodies of the dead, curling between thighs, suggesting rebirth through sexual symbolism. Were these acts literal, or were they theatrical representations of rebirth? The answer may never be clear, but the intent is chilling either way. One Spanish friar, horrified by what he described, claimed to have witnessed obscene rites in which the remains of women were used in ceremonial dances, nude, adorned, posed as if still alive. He wrote of priests invoking the gods of the underworld with chants while circling the corpse, as if drawing forth its remaining power through ritualized contact. To the Maya, the cycle of life and death was sacred, and sexual energy was its axis. Just as bloodletting birthed visions, these necro-rituals symbolized the collapse of boundaries, the merging of death with desire, decay with divinity. Perhaps it was not always literal. Perhaps it was symbolic, the act of placing phallic objects with corpses, of depicting goddesses reborn from the underworld through symbolic unions. But even symbolism, when taken to the edge, can become indistinguishable from horror. What we see as grotesque, they may have seen as sacred, a final offering. A last surrender of the flesh to the gods. These rituals were not common, they were not public, but in elite circles, within the deepest chambers of priesthood and royalty, they existed, as echoes of a belief that even in death, the body could serve. And if death held no boundaries, then what truly separated sanctity from sin? The Maya lived within that question, and so must we. We often look to the past for beauty, for ancient knowledge, lost wisdom, spiritual clarity, and the Maya offer all of that. They built cities that defied the jungle. They charted stars with terrifying precision. They carved gods from stone and pulled time from the sky. But behind the brilliance was blood. Sex, for the Maya, was never private. It was divine currency, a language spoken in flesh and screams. Their gods demanded more than devotion, they demanded the body, the virgin, the captive, even the corpse. To call them monsters would be a mistake. To call them enlightened would be worse. They were human, driven by belief so powerful it eclipsed empathy. They sanctified domination. They ritualized suffering. They used the most intimate act as a bridge to the gods and a weapon of control. And maybe that's the true horror, not that they did these things, but that they believed they were right to. So we are left with a question, one not about them, but about us. Do we judge them through our morality or fear them because some part of us still understands?